This brief history of economic thought appears in my textbook, Economic Essentials for Business, Management, and Engineering. It can be found in section 1.1. An entertaining podcast of this can be found in the QR code, which you can scan simply by stopping this video or pausing this video for a short time. The acknowledged father of economics is Adam Smith, whose book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, appeared in 1759, followed by The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith was interested in poverty, but he did not look to government for the solution. Instead, he looked at the invisible hand of market prices, which would guide resource allocation. He argued that labor specialization would lead to economies of scale, think of a production line, and thereby rising wages. He limited government and was opposed to central planning. So although he was concerned about the poor, he felt that the invisible hand of the market was the best way for them to get out of poverty. He had a problem with government because he saw government like a surrogate decision maker that would seem to imagine that he could arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as a hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. So therefore, Smith advocated for market self-regulation. Thomas Malthus followed Adam Smith. He argued that because population grew geometrically while food production grew arithmetically, starvation was the eventual outcome. We continue to use the term Malthusian to indicate that natural resources would eventually be inadequate to support a growing economy. But Thomas Malthus was also concerned about overproduction and underconsumption, although it was really David Ricardo who really pointed this out. Ricardo argued that technological change eventually led to surplus production, and it meant that wages would be suppressed. Wage suppression then resulted in this underconsumption, and as a result, this followed by economic depressions. Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo did not consider looking at what labor would do in response to falling wage rates. The socialists came along and argued for government, that the government would intervene to keep wage rates from falling. Karl Marx subsequently looked at this particular problem from the point of view of workers struggling against capitalists. He called the workers proletariat and the capitalists the bourgeoisie. He suggested that as capital became more plentiful, there'd be a falling rate of profit, which meant that the capitalists, the owners of the capital, would implement wage cuts, and there would be an eventual revolution leading to communal ownership of the capital, or something which we know as communism. Finally, Alfred Marshall came onto the scene. He was the founder of neoclassical economics, using tools of marginal utility and individual decision-making. Now the idea of utility was around, in fact, the idea of marginal utility was around for quite some time before Marshall. It was not his original idea, because people like Jeremy Bentham already talked about marginal utility. The idea behind marginal utility is that instead of worrying about the entire utility of a person only looked at what the next decision, for example, the next item that he consumed, how much utility that item would give to him when he made decisions. What Marshall did introduce was the idea of supply and demand in the terms of diagrams. So he created supply and demand diagrams and illustrated consumer and producer on those diagrams, although he referred to them as consumer and producer rents. He also introduced the idea of the short-run versus the long run in economic analysis when looking at firms, for example. Early U.S. economists tended to be institutionalists. They included people like Thorstein Veblen, Richard Ely, Frank Knight, and Arthur Burns. Richard Ely was among those who founded the American Economic Association in 1885, and he subsequently became a president of the American Economic Association. Frank Knight became the department head of the so-called Chicago School of Economics. In fact, he was the major advisor of Milton Friedman and several other economists, such as John Buchanan, whom we'll talk about shortly. Arthur Burns was considered to be one of the last of the U.S. institutional economists, and he was at that time, during the 1960s or into the 70s, he was the governor of the U.S. Federal Reserve. The social gospel influenced many U.S. institutionalists. Many of them grew up in Christian homes, although many also subsequently left the Christian faith. They were big supporters. One of the things that institutionalists were supporters of government intervention in the economy, and their institutions dealt primarily with how the government would do that. John Maynard Keynes came along sometime after Marshall and produced a book in 1919, I believe it was, where he looked at the economic consequences of the war, the Great War, World War I. He indicated that, or he suggested that reparation payments by Germany were too great and that they would eventually lead to further conflict with Germany down the road. During the Great Depression, he wrote the General Theory, which advocated government spending in order to increase aggregate demand and stabilize the economy, because aggregate demand was the factor that had fallen. As a result, he is known as the father of macroeconomics, but he's also known for his fiscal policy. In other words, he focused on fiscal policy at the cost of monetary policy. Now, at this time, and even prior to Keynes's coming, Marshall's book on economics was the standard textbook that people tended to use in pretty well all the universities. Now, it's interesting that these early economists, including Keynes, were heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. Many of the early economists subsequently supported eugenics, and they included Keynes and Ely, Commons and Fisher, and they tended to even be leaders in the eugenics movement. The racial determinism that was a characteristic of the eugenics movement was later replaced by oppression narratives, as we will see shortly. Paul Samuelson followed as the great economist after Keynes. He was Keynesian to the core, and he introduced mathematical economics. His economics textbook shaped many generations, including mine. His textbook on economics was in use among most universities from the time period of about 1948 to 1998. For a period of 50 years, his textbook dominated. His view of government was that it was a helping hand. In other words, an agent working for government was considered to be working in the interests of the citizens of the state, whereas that same agent, when that agent was working in the private sector, the agent was considered to be greedy and acting in their own self-interest. Then came the Chicago School and free market defenders. The Chicago School actually began about the same time as Keynes wrote his book, or maybe it began even a bit earlier. It included famous economists such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and James Buchanan. They advocated for limited government strong property rights, and particularly they advocated for freedom. Milton Friedman was a monetarist. He indicated that fiscal policy was not the way in which the Great Depression should have been handled. He argued that the Great Depression was a monetary phenomena and not an aggregate demand phenomena, in the sense that aggregate demand was inadequate to absorb all of this overproduction. Buchanan subsequently founded the field of public choice theory, which looked at politicians as self-interested agents. Remember that Samuelson's agents in government were considered to be, and they included politicians, so both government workers and politicians were thought by Samuelson to be interested only in the welfare of their citizens, but as Buchanan showed, the agents were self-interested and not just interested in the public. That is, whether a person worked in government or whether they worked in the private sector, their main interest was self. It is interesting to note that Paul Samuelson was the first recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, but subsequently Hayek earned a Nobel Prize in Economics, as did Friedman and Buchanan and many other Chicago School economists. The Chicago School was very critical of progressivism. It critiqued Samuelson and the progressives who viewed materialism as a path to utopia. Samuelson and the progressives basically indicated that as people became richer and richer, the chances of war and criminality declined, which of course was an ideological standpoint that was not backed by facts. What the progressives ignored was interest group power, whereas the Chicago School was more interested in liberty over efficiency, which characterized Samuelson and the progressives. They were interested in economic efficiency. Now, if you pause this video and you scan these QR codes, the one on the left is a video of Friedman's discussion of capitalism, and the one on the right is a Prager Institute or Prager University discussion of Friedman's role in, well, the title tells it, No Free Lunch. It is a surprise, perhaps, that many economists might be considered to be anti-capitalist. They see government as a benevolent planner as opposed to that surrogate decision maker that Adam Smith originally identified. One problem is that many economists have a superiority complex. If you wish to look at a strong defense of capitalism, or at least a discussion of capitalism, you might be interested in several books by Jennifer Burns, who is a historian of ideas at Stanford University and the Hoover Institute. She does a comparison of Milton Friedman's ideas and those of Ayn Rand, and if you pause this video, you can scan the QR code to access that particular video. More recent developments in economics include the new institutional economists. They focus on institutions. Institutions matter. And when you look at institutions, you also focus on property rights, on contracts between companies, between individuals, and you look at trust. And when it comes to trust, you think about religion and social capital, where social capital includes trust. These are things that reduce transaction costs. The new institutional economists also looked at ways in which you might wish to limit opportunism in markets and in politics. One of the principal economists in this role of transaction costs is Ronald Coase. He also received a Nobel Prize in economics. In 1936, I believe it was, he looked at transaction costs as a mechanism for explaining the size of firms and firm behavior. Subsequently, in 1960, he wrote a paper on how property rights allocation would affect efficiency. In particular, he looked at the problem of externality, where one person's actions have a negative impact on another person. For example, a smoker will, the smoke from a smoker will be harmful to the non-smoker who is in the same room. Ronald Coase argued that we can get an efficient outcome simply by giving the property rights either to the smoker or to the person affected by the smoke. If the person affected by the smoke has the property rights, then the smoker needs to essentially pay off the non-smoker to be able to smoke, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to smoke. We want to just go a bit to the side here and talk about Herbert Marcuse and the New Left, because they were a Marxist group that left Germany in the early 1930s to escape Hitler, who was anti-Marxist. Thus they were known as the Frankfurt School. Marcuse himself became an American citizen and actually worked for the government during World War II. He advocated the idea of intolerance when he worked at a university later on in the Department of Sociology. He advocated this intolerance towards whatever was the dominant cultural idea. And out of that rose critical race theory and eventually cancel culture. Why is this considered cultural Marxism? It's Marxist because it sees the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed. Marcuse argues that some ideas should be suppressed and censored to liberate the oppressed from those holding cultural hegemony, referring to Western cultural norms rooted in Judeo-Christian thought. As a result, he's considered the father of the New Left, an anti-capitalist. Now, the economist's dilemma is this. The economist favors markets but supports intervention. Many of the ideas that we find in Paul Samuelson's book are often ideological and not evidence-based. They're not evidence-based. And they tend to downplay government failure or overlook it entirely. When the communist regime in Russia or in the Soviet Union fell, Schaefer and Vizhny came up with three models of government that was helpful in looking at how things evolved. One was the invisible hand of Adam Smith, which said that we should have minimal state involvement, but the state was important for protecting property rights. There was also the view that the helping hand view of government, where government existed primarily to correct market failures. But of course, when you have a market failure and you're going to correct it, you have to ensure that the policy you use to correct it does not result in a worse off situation, something which we call government failure. And finally, they looked at government, implying thereby the former Soviet government or communist government, as a grabbing hand model of government, where the government actors pursue their own self-interest. So this is in contrast to Samuelson, of course. And of course, we run into all kinds of problems, and people are against capitalism. And one of the reasons is that capitalism could lead to a high degree of inequality of incomes, which was, of course, Piketty's concern over rising inequality, that he thought that if you had greater inequality in incomes, you actually had a less dynamic economic market. There's, of course, a perception, an ideological perception that is often not corrected by data. In other words, the perception differs from the actual data. And there remains among governments in particular, but also people, a fear of instability, an instability that occurs when we get depressions, when unemployment rises, and so on. Interestingly, Francis Fukuyama, in his book, The End of History, he thought that there was now a balance between liberty and tyranny, that there had been a drift towards tyranny in recent decades, and that he felt that we had now come to a point where this was no longer happening, that the balance between the government role in the economy and the private sector role was about right. He also looked at ethics and morality over economic models. So his idea was that we have now reached the last man and the end of history, as the title of his book indicates, arguing at the time, which was several decades ago now, that we needed to basically stay where we were. Since that time, of course, we've seen an increase in government intervention. So what are the takeaways? The takeaways here are basically that there's still an ongoing debate about all of these things. Economic thought was, of course, shaped by historical events such as the Great Depression and wars. There's been a shift between market optimism and government activism. Institutions and values underpin market performance. So in other words, governments have a role in stability of institutions, in rule of law, in creating the rules of the game, so to speak. And we need to recognize that economics is intertwined with political and sociological ideologies.